Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to IBLF for inviting me to come and speak to you. What I've been told is I should speak for 12 or 15 minutes and then keep 12 or 15 minutes for a conversation. So, the book I want to talk about, I can't talk about 17 books in 15 minutes, is the book that you see on the screen. I gave away my copy to the gentleman at the back, Mr. Dharmendra Rai. It's called Wisdom for Startups from Grown-Ups. And I wrote this book right in the thick of the COVID lockdown. In fact, as my luck would have it, of the 17 books I wrote, 8 books are solo authored and 9 books are co-authored. Now, co-authoring means quite a lot of extra work. And of the 9 co-authored books, 8 came out during the lockdown. So, I don't think the atmosphere was very conducive to launching books and talking about them. So, I grabbed the IBLF opportunity because I wrote this book, or my co-author and I wrote this book with a specific intent. There's a lot of hope being placed on this startup economy in India. And people give all these numbers. So many thousand startups have come, 100 unicorns valued at $100 billion. The fastest unicorns. And that the future of India and employment generation rests with startups. There is, as with all arguments, some truth in it, but as with all arguments, some defects in it. And one day, when I was expounding my views to a small group of people, my own brother, he's just 1 year younger than me, he's my co-author. You don't see his picture there, but in the book his picture is there. Engaged on this subject, rather than talk about aunties and uncles and children. Because his background, he's only 1 year younger, so our professional experience years is not dissimilar, has been largely with startups and for a small part with large companies like Coca-Cola and DCM and Rediffusion. Mine is largely with big companies with occasional spurts of involvement with startups. So we had a sort of 69 kind of format where it sort of matched. And we fiercely disagreed on some things. Luckily, we are brothers, so we didn't fight about it. And I said, hey, listen, when you have such a diversity of views, it has the makings of a book. You know, I'm not going to lose my brother at the age of, lose the affection of my brother at the age we are. And so we sat down and put our heads together and wrote this book. It all happened during this COVID stuff, aided by Zoom. And we wrote it because we think there is a very, very important message. Not only for startups, but for grown-ups, and also for larger policy makers about the Indian economy. I think anybody who thinks that the future of India lies with startups solely, it may be a bit of a crash of the dream. But anybody who ignores startups equally would have missed a big trick. And we sat down and said, what can my grandchildren learn from older people? Now, they are at the age now when they will listen to you because they are at that age. But maybe in another 10 years or maybe 5 years, they say, I have got enough of these oldies. Please get off my back. And we said that startups have this same phenomenon. They think they have learned whatever there is to learn. They have become, especially if they've achieved some newspaper-worthy, pink paper-worthy coverage. But they can learn a lot from grown-ups. The question is that if grown-ups sit back and pontificate, then startups don't like it. Much like if fathers and grandfathers sit and pontificate to their daughters and granddaughters, they don't like it. So can we craft the messages in such a way that they say, yeah, old man, thank you, uncle. That point may be valid. It is something I'll think about. That's all we are trying to achieve. And I thought what I would do is to just tell you an example. There's one chapter at the end of this book which says, chapter 10, so there are 10 chapters in all. It says, what is the secret sauce? So if you want to cut to the chase and ignore the first 9, you'll get the Brahma Mantra in chapter 10. But as always, just learning the Brahma Mantra doesn't help. You have to understand the rituals that go with it. And I want to share just some of these. The first is that to have a startup which is really contributing to the economy, read Silicon Valley, for example, you need a startup ecosystem. It's not just a question of clever founders, young people, technology. And the measure of having a sustainable, of having a good startup ecosystem is you have evidence of sustainable companies over a long period of time. So if you look at our software industry, they were all startups when I began my career. And I can assure you, I did not begin my career when William Hastings was in India or Robert Clive. 50 years ago, nobody knew what's HDFC, nobody knew what's Marico, nobody knew what's Biocon, nobody knew what's TCS, nobody knew what Infosys. Never heard of it. They were not even established, some of them. Today we talk of them as bellwether stocks in the market. And that's what I mean by a sustainable company. Silicon Valley has its entries of sustainable companies. Bill Gates, Microsoft, several other companies, the Googles and the Amazons, are established to be sustainable companies. In our case, if you leave out the software companies and a few others, in the interest of time, I'm not running through all of them, you have very few examples of sustainable companies, to which people argue, well, they're very young. And I say, yeah, sure, they're very young. Then leave them alone in school and college, let them finish. But our finance minister thinks they should be called to Vitta Mantri's Bhavan and be advised on how to develop the economy. So I don't blame the young man if the poor chap thinks that he's got some clever formula for the whole of India. The second thing I want to say is, people say, look at what they did in Silicon Valley. Lessons we can learn from Silicon Valley. There are lessons, no doubt about it. But there is enough research evidence that every society and every country has its own idiosyncratic, native way of developing an ecosystem. The Gujarati way of doing business is very different from the Chettiar way of doing business. Both are very successful traditional entrepreneurs, but they are quite different. Both are successful in their own way. And so is the Sindhi, and so is the Marwadi, and so on and so forth. And we need to discover our own idiosyncratic. And I have not seen any evidence of an idiosyncratic Indian way of developing startups. That was the second objective we had in writing this book. And the last point that we want to bring out in the book is, if you look at nature, nature teaches you a lot. Fruit fly doesn't try to become an elephant. Certainly not in 3 months or 6 months. Why are we doing this? What's the hurry to be a unicorn? What's the purpose of having a turnover which is equal to your losses in the negative direction? And then pretending you have a valuation which should be, and there are sufficient number of people, I hesitate to call them or describe their commercial sense, who believe that this is worth that. And they subscribe to it. And then they come at an IPO price of 1,500, and then they come down to 300. So this cycle of boom, gloom, disappointment needs to be surgically sutured into something that is sustainable. And what are those lessons? And while Tata and Hindustan Lever or Unilever can be considered to be very old companies, Mahindra and Mahindra, Bajaj, there are many great companies in India. We have tried to draw, by researching literature, from Japanese companies which are 500 years old, European companies which are 200 years old, and American companies where shelf life tends to be a bit shorter. We put all this research together and arrived at this Brahma Mantra. Once the Brahma Mantra is revealed, it will look like motherhood and apple pie. For example, and this is just for your illustration, you must have a very consistent purpose. And the description of what all that means is in the book. You must have your eye on the longer term. Third, you must have a very adaptive approach because your ecosystem is going to keep changing. And fourth is you must be financially conservative. This Rambo image of guys who raised 20 billion, 30 billion, well, if they're already 100 billion, I suppose 20 billion is okay, but not if you're 1 billion. In short, treat your startup like your baby at home. There is no universal formula. But if somebody in a generic way says those who give their baby love, education, facilities to the extent they can afford it, and help them to grow up into responsible adults, then give a mother's love to your startup. But what is actually happening in the startup world is that that's not how startups are being nurtured. Or at least the ecosystem that India is so proud of, I'm also proud of, is not working in that direction. And we hope that by sharing the wisdom of grown-ups with startups, and I think a lot more startups would have got our message, whether they agreed with it or not. And I thought if IBLF is hosting me, I would like to come and share with you that the long-term growth of India depends on having sustainable enterprise. I use the word sustainable in terms of profitability, nature, ecosystem, green, all that stuff. 10 companies account for 60% of our market capitalization. We have 19,000 companies on our stock exchange. We have 19,000 companies with a turnover of over 10 crores. How many companies do you have with a turnover less than 10 crores? Company can be under the Companies Act or partnership or whatever. 63 million. 63 million enterprises in India, of whom 19,000 have a turnover of over 10 crores. Of that 19,000, 5,000 are listed on the stock exchange. Of the 5,000 listed in the stock exchange, 100 account for 70% of the market capitalization. What are we talking about? A land of pygmies with a few big men. India needs more big men. Honest, sustainable, large-scale enterprise. Whether they're Tata was also a startup the other day, and so was Infosys and TCS. So we've got some construct in this book which I think would be of interest, and I'm grateful to IBLF for hosting me and allowing me to share at least the headlines of this. I'm finishing my 15 minutes, so on to you, back to you.